The backstage arbitration hall in Seoul was packed. Every seat filled, every corridor buzzing with anticipation. But this was no ordinary dispute. Standing at the complainants' table was none other than BTS's Jimin, joined by a few of his bandmates quietly supporting from the front row. The tension was palpable. Some people whispered, others nudged their friends, and more than a few discreetly tried to record the moment on their phones. Outside, a row of media vans lined the street, satellite dishes aimed at the sky, ready to broadcast any unexpected turn of events to the entire world. Jimin had faced enormous challenges before: criticism, intense schedules, and the pressures of global fame. But Toei, his adversary, was different. He was standing against the Entertainment Arbitration Board itself. The case seemed straightforward, a dispute over the unauthorized use of a BTS performance concept. But the stakes were far greater. A major entertainment conglomerate, backed by powerful executives and influential industry figures, had staged an elaborate award show act based on a unique performance design that Jimin and his friends had created, one they had planned for their own upcoming world tour. It wasn't just an act of artistic theft. It was a blatant violation that threatened to erase months of creative work and diminish BTS's ability to surprise their fans with original artistry. Jimin had tried to resolve the issue quietly. Emails, phone calls, official complaints. Everything was ignored. Now he was here, ready to defend not only his work, but the integrity of the group's artistry. The atmosphere was electric when the lead adjudicator, Mr. Han Soo-jin, entered the room. A seasoned industry figure in his 60s, he had seen countless disputes, but this one was different. Adjusting his glasses, he glanced at Jimin with faint amusement, allowing a slight smirk. "Mr. Park," he said, lightly tapping his gavel, "I understand you've decided to represent yourself today." Jimin, standing tall and composed despite the pressure, nodded calmly, his determined gaze fixed on the adjudicator. "That's right," he said. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others smiled, expecting a disaster. Even the opposing counsel, Mr. Kang, one of the most expensive lawyers in the industry, let out a quiet laugh. Mr. Han leaned forward. "You are aware that arbitration hearings aren't like fan meetings, correct? Here, there are rules and procedures. This isn't a stage for promises or inspirational speeches." The chuckles in the room grew louder. Journalists' pens scratched furiously across notepads. One whispered, "This will be headline gold." But Jimin didn't flinch. He let the laughter fade on its own. Then in a clear, steady voice, he replied, "I know the rules, sir, and I know the industry." Mr. Han raised an eyebrow. "And where exactly did you study entertainment law, Mr. Park?" The room erupted in laughter again. Jimin, unshaken, opened a folder and placed a thick, perfectly organized file on the table. Gently tapping the first page, he said, "For the last 6 months, I've reviewed every contract clause, every intellectual property regulation, and every precedent in cases like this. I have studied performance rights laws, broadcast agreements, and licensing standards. And here I have the evidence to show that not only was our creative work stolen, but it was used in a way that directly undermined our artistic rights and misled our audience." His voice was firm, unwavering. "I'm here to present that evidence. If this panel seeks the truth, then let's begin." The laughter stopped. For the first time, the room understood Jimin wasn't here to put on a show or to protect his image. He was here to win. Mr. Han cleared his throat, aware of the weight of his own earlier mockery. "Very well, Mr. Park, you may continue." Jimin took his seat. His expression was unreadable. But as the murmurs faded and the hearing officially began, one thing was certain. This was no ordinary case, and Jimin was no ordinary artist. Jimin didn't smile or flinch. He simply straightened the stack of documents before him, then stood slowly, placing both hands firmly on the table. "You're right," he said in a steady voice. "This isn't a performance, and I'm not here to entertain you, Mr. Kang." The silence in the room was immediate. Jimin picked up a thick file and began flipping through the pages. "You want to talk about experience? Let's talk about facts." He held up a high-resolution still from rehearsal footage, a stage set design blueprint dated early 2021. This is our original concept, fully documented and registered with the Creative Rights Association. Then he displayed another image from late 2023, showing a nearly identical set used by the rival entertainment company during a major awards ceremony. And this, Jimin said, pointing to the similarities, is your client's production, clearly using our designs without permission. Kang shifted uncomfortably, but Jimin continued. He pulled out a printout of an email. This is the first cease and desist notice I sent when we discovered the concept was being copied. He flipped the page. This is the second notice, no reply. He flipped again, and this is the third. He looked directly at Kang. Do you see a pattern here? Kang cleared his throat. Mr. Park, creative disputes are rarely that simple. There are industry complexities. Jimin raised a hand, cutting him off. They ignored the rules until we caught them. The room froze. Even the lead adjudicator, Mr. Han, looked surprised. He'd seen artists defend themselves before, but never with the confidence, precision, and conviction Jimin displayed. Jimin didn't hesitate. He didn't ramble. He was meticulous, clear, and most importantly, correct. Kang forced a laugh. Sir, I think we might be overreacting. This is barely the opening argument. While Mr. Park knows how to handle a room, we're still talking about technicalities here. Mr. Han, who had dismissed this case as little more than an industry squabble, was no longer so sure. He looked between Kang and Jimin, feeling a pang of regret for underestimating the young man before him. Very well, Han said at last. Mr. Kang, you'll have your turn to respond later. For now, I want to hear more from Mr. Park. Jimin nodded slightly and sat down. His expression remained calm, but Kang's discomfort was obvious. Underestimating Jimin had been a mistake, and not the only one made in that room. By the end of the day, the news had spread like wildfire. Entertainment reporters camped outside, live streaming updates to millions of fans worldwide. Headlines wrote themselves. Jimin stuns industry lawyers, wins first round in performance rights dispute. Lead adjudicator regrets underestimating BTS star. Clips from the hearing circulated nonstop online. Industry analysts debated it on talk shows. No one expected Jimin to know so much about performance rights law, one panelist admitted. But clearly, he's done his homework. He's precise, disciplined, and frankly, he commands the room better than many lawyers I've seen. As Jimin exited the building, journalists surrounded him. Mr. Park, did you expect to make such a strong impression? Jimin adjusted his cap and shrugged lightly. I only came to tell the truth. Another reporter called out, do you really think you can win this case without a legal team? Jimin paused, turned toward the cameras, and said, justice doesn't depend on how expensive your lawyer is. It depends on what's right. With that, he walked calmly to his car, ignoring the sea of flashing lights. The next morning, the hearing hall was even more crowded. Reporters from around the world filled the gallery, eager to see whether Jimin could keep up the pressure or if the defense would finally push back. But Kang had dropped the courteous tone. Striding toward the adjudicator's bench, he said in a cold voice, Sir, given the overwhelming media attention this case has attracted, I believe it is necessary to require Mr. Park to hire an attorney or withdraw his claim. A murmur ran through the room. Mr. Han turned to Jimin. Mr. Park, your response. Jimin stood, placing his hands lightly on the table. Of course I have a response. This is a public hearing, and the people are watching. But let me make one thing clear. The media didn't steal our concept. The media didn't ignore my cease and desist letters. And the media didn't file this claim. I did. He locked eyes with Kang. They want me to hire a lawyer. Why? Because I'm starting to make them nervous? Kang forced a smile. Not at all. I simply meant the process is complex, even for experienced attorneys. Jimin nodded. I'm sure it is. But as far as I know, no rule says an artist can't defend their own work, unless you no longer believe creators have that right. The murmurs grew louder. Mr. Han cleared his throat. Mr. Kang, I understand your concern, but Mr. Park has every right to represent himself. Kang clenched his jaw, knowing he had just lost another round. Then Jimin called his first witness. Mr. Choi, a retired stage designer with over 30 years in the industry, who had worked with BTS's set layouts for over a decade. Mr. Choi, Jimin began, You've reviewed the original design files and concept sketches, correct? That's right, Mr. Park. I've known your team's work for years, and these designs have never changed ownership. Jimin held up a document. Can you confirm this is the original copyright certificate? Choi examined it, then nodded. It clearly states that the concept belongs to BTS. Jimin turned to the panel. There you have it, the law in black and white. Kang jumped up. Objection. Mr. Park isn't qualified to interpret legal documents in front of the panel. The adjudicator sighed. Objection sustained, Mr. Park. Continue, but keep your questions within the legal framework. Perfect, Jimin replied. I'll keep it simple. He looked back at Choi. Has there ever been a legal dispute over this design before? Never. No further questions. Kang tried to attack the testimony, suggesting mistakes in design registrations were common, but Choi was clear. Not in this case, the records are crystal clear. Mr. Choi's testimony was firm. Not in this case, he said. The records are crystal clear. The day moved on. Then Jimin called Mr. Lee Hae-jin, the CEO of the rival entertainment company accused of stealing the BTS concept. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Laughter was gone, replaced by a heavy tension. Lee, dressed in a sharp designer suit and wearing an air of superiority, sat down confidently. Mr. Kang began, Mr. Lee, your company acted within the proper legal framework when producing this stage performance, correct? Of course, Lee replied with a smirk. We conducted a complete review before moving forward. So you believe Mr. Park is wrong about the originality of this concept? Exactly, Lee answered, his smile mocking. When Jimin approached the podium, the entire room held its breath. Without glancing at his notes, he held up a high-quality image of the original BTS set design, dated months before the rival performance. Recognize this? Lee barely looked at it. It seems like some stage concept. Not some stage concept, Jimin said calmly. Our stage concept before you touched it. He then held up another image, this one from the televised award show, where Lee's company had unveiled their suspiciously similar stage. And this? Lee shifted in his seat. I suppose that's from our production. Holding both images side by side, Jimin asked, then explain why your company's set is almost identical to ours. Lee scoffed. Similarities happen. In the industry, ideas often overlap. Jimin turned to the panel. Creative work isn't accidentally copied. It's taken deliberately. He placed the images down and lifted a printed cease and desist letter. Did you personally receive this? Lee hesitated before answering. I suppose so. And did you stop production after receiving it? Lee's jaw tightened. No. The room erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Jimin didn't need to say more. Silence carried the weight of his point. As he returned to his seat, he noticed the panel members, some of whom had been skeptical, now leaning forward, serious and attentive. Mr. Han rubbed his forehead. He had underestimated Jimin. Everyone had. While the defense scrambled during the recess, whispers filled the room. This is no longer just about stage designs, a reporter muttered. He's becoming a symbol against industry exploitation, another replied. Across the aisle, Kang leaned toward Lee. We need a new strategy. If we don't stop him soon, we'll lose everything. Lee, visibly agitated, nodded. Do whatever you have to. But on Jimin's side, there was no rush, no fear. When the truth is on your side, you don't need to fight dirty. You just let the facts speak for themselves. When the hearing resumed, and one thing was clear, those who had entered with arrogance now feared losing everything. Jimin remained seated at his table, hands clasped, expression calm, as the defense whispered strategy under their breath. Mr. Han sighed and turned to Kang. You may proceed with your next witness. Kang stood, straightened his jacket, and addressed the room. The defense calls Mr. Kim Do-hyun, senior industry auditor. A bald man in his early 60s took the stand with a neutral expression, swearing to tell the truth. Mr. Kim, Kang began, you've worked in stage production auditing for over 35 years, correct? That's correct, Kim replied. And in that time, you've seen disputes arise from mistakes in registration or miscommunication between production teams? Of course, it happens more often than people think. Sometimes official design registrations require revisions after updates or measurements. Kang turned subtly toward the panel. steering them toward doubt. So would you say it's possible Mr. Park's claim is based on an outdated registration of his design? Kim hesitated, then said, "It's possible." Kang smiled, satisfied. "Thank you, Mr. Kim. No further questions." He seemed to have gained ground until Jimin rose from his chair, walking toward the witness stand with measured steps. "In your 35 years," Jimin began, looking directly at Kim, "how often have you seen production companies deliberately copy another artist's work, assuming no one would challenge them?" Kim blinked, uneasy. "I couldn't say for sure." Jimin slid a document across the table. "This is the history of previous copyright disputes involving Mr. Lee's company. Read it. How many times have they been accused of infringement?" Kim adjusted his glasses, scanning the page. His face tightened. 5 cases. "And how many were settled quietly out of the public eye?" Kim hesitated. "All of them." Gasps filled the room. Jimin turned to the panel. "This isn't about an innocent mistake. It's about a pattern. A man who's done it before and paid his way out every time." Kang jumped up. "Objection. This is irrelevant." Mr. Han frowned, but his voice was steady. "Objection denied. Continue, Mr. Park." Jimin nodded. "Just one more question. Mr. Kim, have you personally reviewed the official registration for our original stage design?" "No, personally I haven't." Jimin glanced at the adjudicator. "No further questions." As Jimin returned to his seat, Kang's frustration was impossible to hide. His own witness had admitted he hadn't even examined the most crucial evidence. "This is a joke," Lee muttered to Kang. "I pay you to win, not to look incompetent." "Calm down," Kang whispered back tensely. "We haven't lost yet." But the confidence in his voice was fading. When it was time for closing arguments, Kang took a deep breath and addressed the panel. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've seen quite a spectacle these past days. But remember, justice isn't a performance, it's the law. And the law, I submit, is not on Mr. Park's side." He tried to downplay the issue as a misunderstanding, insisting there was no malicious intent. When he finished, Jimin stood slowly and looked at the panel. "I've been in many battles," he said, "but none of them were about letting the powerful do whatever they want without consequences." He turned toward Lee. "You knew what you were doing. You thought I wouldn't fight. You thought I'd take a payout like others before me. You thought you could steal what we created and get away with it." He paused. "Justice isn't measured by how much money you have. It's measured by doing what's right." He looked at each panel member, one by one. "That's all I have to say." The room was silent. Mr. Han adjourned the hearing until the next day. But as the panel began to file out, he turned to Jimin. "Do you have more witnesses?" "Yes," Jimin replied, "I do. I call Mr. Min Jae-hyun." The name sent a ripple through the hearing room. Kang and Lee exchanged confused glances. "Who the hell is that?" Lee whispered. "No idea," Kang muttered back. The doors opened, and in walked a man in a worn crew jacket and scuffed work boots, his face weathered from years in the industry. He took the oath to tell the truth. Jimin stepped forward. "Mr. Min, what do you do?" "I'm a stage technician. I've been in this business for over 20 years. "And for whom have you recently worked?" Min hesitated. "For Lee Entertainment Group." The air shifted. "Objection!" Kang barked. "This witness was not disclosed." Mr. Han raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Park?" Jimin replied calmly. "Mr. Min came forward voluntarily last night, after hearing the testimony. He has information he no longer wants to keep hidden." Turning back to Min, Jimin said, "Tell us." Min lowered his gaze. "I didn't want to be part of a cover-up." Murmurs erupted. Mr. Han called for order. "Was there a second set of design files?" Jimin asked. Min nodded. "So, yes, they weren't officially registered, but they were altered to copy BTS's concept while making it look like it was original." "Do you have proof?" Min pulled a USB drive from his pocket. "I backed up everything, both the official project and the altered one." Mr. Hain ordered the files to be reviewed immediately. "Did Mr. Lee know these files existed?" Jimin pressed. Min nodded again. "Yes, we all knew. We were told to stay quiet." "And why are you speaking now?" Min took a deep breath. "Because I saw someone fighting purely for justice, and I realized I needed to be that kind of person too." The room fell silent. Jimin gave a small nod. No more questions. Kang didn't even attempt cross-examination. Mr. Han called for a recess. Across the room, Lee's face was pale. "What just happened?" he whispered to Kang. "You said we had this under control," Lee hissed. "That was before your own staff turned against you," Kang muttered, running a hand over his face. "We're in trouble." Jimin, seated quietly on the other side, didn't smile, didn't celebrate, just waited. He knew exactly what was coming. And now, for the first time since the hearing began, Lee knew too. Outside, journalists scrambled to file breaking headlines. Key insider turns against Lee's entertainment. BTS's Jimin exposes hidden industry corruption. When the session resumed, the panel returned with grave expressions. The weight of Min's confession and the digital evidence was impossible to ignore. "Mr. Kang," Han said, "do you have a motion?" Kang stood, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, we request a postponement to review these files." Jimin had expected this. "Denied," Han said firmly. "The defense has had ample time to present its records. Now, thanks to a whistleblower, we have the truth. We will proceed to closing arguments." Kang swallowed hard and addressed the panel. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard strong arguments from both sides, but I urge you to remember this is not a show, it's a legal process. My client is a respected producer. This is a misunderstanding over creative similarities, not a crime. I ask you to view it as such." He returned to his seat. Jimin stood, hands in his pockets, making no dramatic gestures. "I don't have a prepared speech," he said quietly. "I only have one performance concept, a concept my team created, nurtured, and protected, that was taken piece by someone who thought no one would fight back." His voice was low, but every word cut through the silence. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a coincidence. It was greed. He turned slightly toward Lee. "That's the truth." Then he looked back at the panel. "You've seen the evidence. You've heard the truth. And you've also heard those who want you to believe it was just a misunderstanding. But you already know the truth." He gave a small nod. "That's all." Mr. Han addressed the panel. "The case is now in your hands." The room buzzed with hushed conversations. At the defense table, Lee no longer looked angry, only afraid. "We should have settled," he muttered. "Yes," Kang said grimly, "we should have." Hours passed. The tension was suffocating. Then the jury spokesperson entered with a sealed envelope. "Have you reached a verdict?" Han asked. "Yes, sir." The spokesperson handed over the envelope. Han read it silently before speaking. "The panel has ruled in favor of the complainant, Mr. Park Jimin. It is determined that Lee Entertainment Group acted in bad faith, knowingly copying protected creative material. The company is ordered to pay full compensation for damages, along with additional sanctions for willful misconduct." Absolute silence. Jimin didn't react immediately. He let the words settle over the room. Then Han turned to him. "Mr. Park, would you like to say a few words?" Jimin stood slowly. "I've been in many battles," he said, "but this wasn't a performance. This was justice. And this time no one could take it away." Jimin was standing up for what was right. He paused, his gaze shifting to Lee. "Mr. Lee took what was ours and thought he could get away with it. Thought he could bypass the rules, silence the truth, and profit at the expense of our art and our connection with fans. Then he looked at the panel, but the law caught up with him. And today you've made sure that justice prevailed." A soft murmur of approval moved through the room. Jimin continued, his voice steady but with a sharp edge of conviction. "This wasn't just about one performance concept. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it isn't easy. And I want to thank you for having the courage to do so." He turned to the adjudicator without further comment. Mr. Han nodded, his tone softer. "This panel recognizes the verdict. The defendant is ordered to pay full compensation for damages, in addition to the claimant's legal costs. This hearing is adjourned." The sharp bang of the gavel echoed. Chaos erupted instantly. Journalists rushed toward Jimin, shouting questions, while Lee's legal team sat in stunned silence, struggling to process the defeat. Jimin didn't linger. He rose, nodded politely to Mr. Han, and walked past Lee's table without a glance. The verdict spoke louder than any words. Outside, the world was waiting. Microphones, flashing cameras, every outlet desperate for a statement. Jimin raised a hand for quiet. He took a breath and looked directly into the cameras. Today, justice was done. But this isn't just about one artist defending his work. It's about every creator who's ever had their art stolen, about everyone who's seen their rights trampled. I'm here to tell you, we all deserve justice, no matter who we are. And with that, he walked away. A quiet hero in his own story. Inside, the defeat was total. Lee sat slumped in his chair, pale, fists clenched. Kang, his lawyer, wordlessly packed up the files. "This isn't over," Lee muttered bitterly. Kang sighed. "Yes, it is. You gambled and you lost. You can appeal, but this wasn't about technicalities. The panel saw you for who you are. The press has already shredded your reputation. You're finished." Lee clenched his jaw, but he knew Kang was right. His company's reputation was destroyed. Stock prices were plummeting, investors were withdrawing, and industry regulators had already announced a review of his other productions. For the first time in his career, Lee was facing real accountability. Days later, Jimin returned to the practice studio where the original concept had been born. The rival company's props and unauthorized designs were gone. The stage mock-ups, the sketches, the recordings, they were all back where they belonged. He stood in the center of the rehearsal space, looking around at the empty stage, feeling the weight of the silence. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a declaration. No one, no matter how much influence or money they had the right to take what didn't belong to them. As he walked toward the stage edge, he saw a familiar figure, Mr. Han, standing with his hands in his pockets. "I didn't expect to see you here," Jimin said. Han smiled faintly. "I thought I owed you a proper handshake. I underestimated you at the start." Jimin studied him for a moment. "You weren't the only one." Han extended his hand. "Consider this an official apology." Jimin shook it firmly. "I appreciate it." Han glanced at the stage. "What will you do now? Perform this concept at the tour?" Jimin looked around at the space. "No, I'm going to keep it safe, for the right moment. Some things are worth preserving." Han nodded. "What everyone would have fought like you did. Most would have taken a settlement and walked away." Jimin gave a small smile. "I'm not most people." Han laughed. "That's for sure." The adjudicator left, and Jimin remained there for a moment, looking at the place where the fight had begun. The battle might be over, but he knew the industry would keep turning. Big companies would keep trying to cut corners. People like Lee would keep appearing. But as long as there were artists willing to stand their ground, justice would always have a chance. With one last look at the stage, Jimin adjusted his cap, turned toward the door, and walked away, leaving the rest of the world to talk about the legend he had just written.